My best friends live in the woods. The Adventures of Albert by Michelle Mracek.
Chapter 46. Gossip and Giggles. Gabby and George, Larissa and Albert burst through the front door and ran straight to Mother Skunk. "It's Fred!" They were all yelling at once. Mother Skunk was tying a bundle of mugwort leaves to hang to dry. "What? Who is Fred?" she laughed. The exuberant smiles of the children were contagious. "You know, F.R. It's Fred Rabbit!" Albert burst out, the secret revealed at last. "You met him?" Mother Skunk gasped, dropping the leaves. George was hopping up and down excitedly. "We did. He tied up the tomatoes," he burst out. "Yeah, and he gave Mama flowers with another wooden spoon," Gabby said, giggling. "But he's kind of ugly," she added with a shrug. "Not on the inside," Albert corrected her. "He seems very considerate, and he's trying really hard to make a good impression," Albert added thoughtfully. "Where's your mama now?" Mother Skunk asked Gabby. "At home. She invited Fred in for tea," she giggled. "Yeah, she forgot we were even there," George laughed. "They held hands and went in. We were all just standing there." Mother Skunk joined in the merriment. "Phyllis and Fred. That has a nice ring to it," she laughed. Daniel and Charlie came running up and started chanting, "Phyllis and Fred, Phyllis and Fred, Phyllis and Fred," as they ran in circles. Larissa snatched Charlie off his feet as he ran past. He was all squirms, kicking feet and giggles. "So, tell me more," Mother Skunk said, picking up her mugwort leaves. She finished tying them up and brushed off her hands and took off her apron. She wanted to hear this. "What was he like?" Gabby's nose crinkled. "He has really big buck teeth and a big nose and a crooked ear with a scar," she blurted out. "He was wearing a straw hat," George added. "I've never seen a hat like that before." "He didn't have an accent," Albert observed. "I don't think he's from around here. Probably just passing through," Albert said with a more serious tone. "Oh, heavens, I hope not," Mother Skunk said, alarmed. "Phyllis would be devastated if he went to all this trouble to get her attention just to leave again." "True," Albert nodded. "That wouldn't make much sense." "Maybe he's planning on staying," Albert offered. "Well, this is news," Mother Skunk said, trotting over to the front door. She lifted her bonnet off its peg. "I'm going to the Great Glen to tell Clarissa." "I'm going to go tell Jimmy Squirrel," George said, heading out the door. "I'm going to tell Bluebell," Larissa said right behind them. "I'll come too," Gabby joined Larissa. Charlie and Daniel had been taking it all in. "I'm going to go tell Chitty Witty," Charlie said. "Me too," Daniel said right behind Charlie. Suddenly, Albert was standing all alone in the kitchen. He laughed, looking around the empty cave. "Well, I guess I'll go tell Clara," he said to himself and stepped out the door. Now that the secret of F.R. was revealed, the birds were no longer obligated to keep silent. The canopy was all a-twitter with gossip. Mrs. Robin had been obligated to tell a little lie to Mrs. Rabbit. She had indeed known who left the flowers on her front porch, but now that they had met, she flew straight to Ann the Dove to share in the fun of the gossip chain. Mrs. Robin had been a bit annoyed with Ann's new post as messenger, but decided not to be jealous and to be proud of her friend. Things were right between them again. Mrs. Robin had taken to boasting, "I'm best friends with the new messenger, Ann," when talking to the other birds. These days, Ann was pretty easy to find. She was either at the Great Glen with Chad and Penelope, or at the mouse nest with them. Penelope was quite the baker, and now had a whole crew under her training. Mrs. Robin headed straight for the Great Glen. When she arrived, everyone was gathered around Mother Skunk. He wears a straw hat, she was telling the excited group gathered around her. And the dove cooed her hello as Mrs. Robin flew in. That's right, Mrs. Robin agreed with Mother Skunk. I met Fred days ago. He pleaded with me to keep a secret, she said with self-importance. Did you know he came up from a place near a human town? He said it was called Blue Eye. Mrs. Robin was quite pleased with her inside information. Albert said he had an accent, Mother Skunk added in agreement. He does, Mrs. Robin agreed. He says some strange things like ain't and y'all and fixin'. Clarissa was enjoying the news. It wasn't often someone new came to the forest, and this someone seemed like he intended to stay. So, the important thing is, how nice is he? Clarissa asked. Mother Skunk nodded in agreement. Judging by his gifts, he's quite kind. I've seen the first flower bouquet that Phyllis brought back to my house. It was huge and in a carved wooden vase with a heart on it. Very impressive. You know, he carved that himself, Mrs. Robin added. He would sit for hours working on it when Mrs. Rabbit was at the cave. I flew over and watched. He called it Whitlin. Clarissa was looking back and forth between Mrs. Robin and Mother Skunk. This is fun, she giggled. I wonder if we should go over to the walnut tree and pay them a visit. You won't recognize it, Mrs. Robin said with an excited flap of her wing. He painted the front door bright yellow and hung a wreath. I heard about that, Mother Skunk agreed. I would like to see it. Maybe a visit is a good idea, she agreed with a giggle. Meanwhile, George was standing under the oak tree throwing acorns up at Jimmy Squirrel. Jimmy was laughing and throwing them back. Good shot, Jimmy laughed as he threw one back. It hit George in the ear. Ouch, George laughed. Hey, come down. I know who FR is, George called up. Jimmy wrinkled his nose. No way, he called down. Way, George laughed. Suit yourself. If I leave, you'll never know, George teased. Jimmy flicked his tail and scampered down from his new nest. Why are you wearing your bow tie? George asked Jimmy as he reached the ground. Jimmy kicked the dirt and looked down. I was going to see Misty, he shrugged. Well, tell you what. Let's both go get her, and I'll tell you both what I found out. George hopped with excitement. Great idea, Jimmy smiled and scampered off, George hopping along behind as fast as he could to keep up. Misty was nibbling on a clover flower in the shade of a tall pine when they bounded up. My goodness, why in such a rush? You startled me, she said, a clover stem still hanging out of her mouth. Isn't she cute? Jimmy whispered in George's ear. I know who FR is, George blurted out, trying to catch his breath. Misty nibbled in the rest of her clover and sat down, smoothing her apron. Okay, who is FR? She asked George. I met him. It's Fred Rabbit. George was so excited he could hardly sit still. What's he like? Jimmy asked, sitting down next to Misty. He wears this really neat-looking hat, George started. I really want one of those hats, George said with longing. So what about the hat? What is he like? Jimmy asked impatiently. Well, he seems to be sweet on Mama and keeps bringing her presents, George said, wriggling his ears. Presents? What kind of presents? Misty asked. Now she was really interested. You know, stuff girls like, flowers mostly, George shrugged. Well, he sounds perfectly wonderful, Misty sighed. James gave me flowers and I still have them, Misty said, smiling at Jimmy. James? George laughed and looked confused. Yeah, James, get over it, Jimmy said to George, looking up and rolling his eyes. Well, anyway, he carved stuff out of wood. I'd like to learn how to do that, George continued. Where is he now? Jimmy asked. I guess still at the house. Mama invited him in for tea. George pretended to be drinking from a teacup, and they all giggled. Well, I'd like to meet him, Misty said, standing up. Okay, George shrugged. Let's go. And the three scampered toward the walnut tree. Back at Bluebell's new front door, Larissa and Gabby were knocking loudly. Coming, they heard Bluebell from inside. As she swung open the sturdy blue door, the two girls were both talking at once. What at a time, Bluebell laughed. What's going on? We know who FR is, Larissa said. She was so excited she could hardly get the words out. Gabby grabbed Bluebell's hand and started pulling her out the door. Come on, we'll show you, she said, her ears wiggling. Hold on, let me get Benjamin, Bluebell said as she got free of Gabby's grasp and ducked back inside. In just a moment, she was back with Benjamin. So, who is FR? He asked. Gabby grabbed Bluebell's hand again and started pulling her out the door. Come on! She hopped up and down. Well, I guess we're going to the walnut tree, Benjamin laughed. Back at Clara's house, Albert was holding out a small bouquet of bright orange daisies with dark black seed centers. The contrast was striking. He had swung a bit out of his way to pick them. Seeing all this fuss over FR and flowers, he figured Clara would really like to have a bouquet of her own. The twinkle in her eyes when he held them out to her confirmed it. She giggled as she took them. Thank you, Albert, she smiled. You're the kindest, most thoughtful soul. Albert grinned back at her. I have news, he said with a teasing, mysterious tone. Clara's eyes widened. Oh, really? Do tell. I've met FR over at Mrs. Rabbit's garden. Clara clapped her hands. Oh my! Did you find out what FR means? She asked. Albert nodded. Fred Rabbit. We were headed over to stake up the tomatoes, and when we got there, someone had already done it. Then this tall rabbit in a straw hat comes walking up and introduces himself. He had tied up all the tomatoes to be a help to Mrs. Rabbit. He certainly tried to make a good first impression, Albert explained. Who else knows? Clara asked. I assume about everybody by now. I was at Mrs. Rabbit's with Larissa, Gabby, and George. We all ran home to the cave to tell Mother. She ran to the Great Glen with the news. Larissa and Gabby ran over to Bluebell's. George ran to Jimmy Squirrel's, and Charlie and Daniel ran to tell Chitty Witty. Clara listened thoughtfully. Then perhaps we should swing over to Chitty Witty's and make sure Charlie and Daniel get home without getting into trouble. Albert nodded in agreement. First, let me put these in some water, Clara said, taking the bouquet inside. As they headed toward the chipmunks, Clara was all chatty with excitement. So, what did he look like? Albert smiled. If you ask Gabby, he has a very big nose. But I think if you ask Mrs. Rabbit, he looks quite charming. Clara nodded. As it should be, she giggled. Mrs. Rabbit is looking through the eyes of love. She smiled and squeezed Albert's hand. As they arrived at the chipmunk's den, it looked like the entire chipmunk population of the whole forest was gathered around Daniel and Charlie, listening to them tell the news. Chitty Witty spotted Albert and Clara and waved. Let's ask Albert, Chitty Witty said. He was there. Ask me what? Albert said as they came closer. This Fred Rabbit, is he safe? I mean, will he fit in? Chitty Witty's mother voiced the question they were almost concerned with. Albert hadn't even considered this, but for some of the tiniest forest folk, it did make sense to ask. I think he is helpful and considerate, so yes, I think he's nice and will fit in, Albert said most sincerely. Charlie chimed in. I want to see the straw hat. Me too, Chitty Witty said with an excited flick of his tail. Clara laughed. Well, let's go to the walnut tree and meet him, she offered. Good idea! Everyone clapped and cheered. And so, from every corner of the forest, folk were marching toward the walnut tree to meet Fred Rabbit. Anne had flown Penelope and Chad from the Great Glen back to the mice nest to tell the news, and they too were scampering toward the walnut tree. Tommy Red Fox saw Albert and Clara heading up a little parade with Daniel and Charlie and all the chipmunks. Everyone merrily chatting. What's going on? Tommy called over. We're going to meet Fred Rabbit at the walnut tree, Albert called out. Mind if I come? Tommy asked. Albert waved him over and he bounded over to join the group. As their parade passed the new beaver dam, Mrs. Beaver, Tulip, and Junior were sunning themselves on the bank. Heavens, what's going on? She asked. We know who F.R. is. It's Fred Rabbit, and we're going to meet him, Charlie hailed over to her. Oh boy, let me tell Papa and the Badgers, she said excitedly. Meet us at the walnut tree, Albert called over as they continued. Completely unaware that the entire forest was descending upon them, Fred and Phyllis were enjoying a cup of tea at the kitchen table. Thank you for leaving me a note, Fred was saying with his big toothy grin. Mrs. Rabbit looked down at her teacup and squirmed in her seat. Oh, well, yes, of course, she stammered, embarrassed. They heard a knock at the door, and Mrs. Rabbit looked annoyed. Now, who could that be? She said as she stood and walked over to answer it. Who is it? She called out. You cannot imagine the shock on her face when she heard every name of every creature in the forest call back in response. Frightened and confused, she glanced back at Fred, wide-eyed. Let me deal with this, he said, hopping to the door. He gently held her by the shoulders and moved her behind him. Took a deep breath and slowly opened the yellow door. Imagine his surprise as he saw a huge circle of forest folk staring back at him. He glanced back at Phyllis and asked, Are these your friends? Mrs. Rabbit peeked around from behind him. Her eyes grew huge in amazement as she stammered, Why, yes, actually, it's all of them. Fred turned back to the gathered group, smiled a big toothy grin, and waved. Howdy, y'all. Name's Fred. Pleased to meet ya. A few folk timidly waved back, but mostly everyone just kept staring, not knowing what to say. Looking around at the stunned group, the great stag stepped forward. Everyone has heard of you, and we are all concerned for our dear friend, Mrs. Rabbit. Fred nodded. The great stag continued. Are you just passing through, or do you intend on staying and becoming a valued member of our community? The stag stood his ground and waited for an answer. Fred turned to Mrs. Rabbit and held his hand out to her. He gently led her from behind him to stand next to himself. I am deeply touched by your friends, Fred said to her. So, to answer their concerns, let me explain myself. Phyllis nodded him on and smiled shyly. I left my forest because of the hound dog. I lived near a human town called Blue Eye, and mostly it was a fine place, till one day a man moved in with a huge, vicious creature he called Hound Dog. Every one of the forest folks tightened in their circle around the front door to hear Fred's story. This creature had long ears, as long as mine, but kind of rounded, and they hung down and flopped around like dish towels. It had a big head and a huge jaw. It would slobber and sleep on the porch most of the day, so I thought it must be safe. Boy, howdy, did I misjudge this creature. One day, I come strolling by, and it lifts its head and lets out the most hideous sound of a howl you ever heard come out of a mouth. I froze in shock, but the thing bounds towards me. In 2 leaps, it was upon me, ready to devour me with those big, slobbery teeth. Fred waved his arms wildly to illustrate the attack, and everyone listening gasped. Fred smiled a big smile and continued, "But I have some big teeth of my own, and just as the beast grabbed my left ear, I managed to spin around and sink my teeth into one of its paws. It let out another horrible howl, and when it did, it opened its mouth, and I was able to run away. I ran and ran and ran and didn't stop till I was clear away from town." Albert stepped forward. "That must have been terrible for you, and I hope your ear's better," he said, eyeing the scarred and bent left ear. Fred nodded. "Why, thank you," he grinned. Albert continued, "And while that is very exciting and interesting, it doesn't have anything to do with Mrs. Rabbit." Fred lifted Mrs. Rabbit's hand and kissed the back of it. "I was getting to that part," he said with a smile. "So, you see, I thinks to myself, Fred, you can't go back there no more. It's too dangerous. So, I decides to keep moving. I figured I was missing a purpose in my life, and I sets out to find it." Fred paused and looked over to Phyllis, who was wide-eyed, taking in his every word. "Then one afternoon, I hear someone singing a lovely song about the garden, and I decide to take me a look. I sneaks over and hides myself behind a bush, and what I sees makes my head spin. Lo and behold, and hallelujah, it's Mrs. Rabbit, the prettiest little gal I ever laid eyes on. I was glued to the spot. I had planned on passing through, but my heart has found its purpose. Turns out, Phyllis, it's you." All the forest folk clapped and cheered. Fred looked back over his shoulder and tipped his hat to the crowd. "Oh, I forgot you were all out there." Fred laughed. Then he got down on one knee and took off his hat. Still holding Mrs. Rabbit's hand, he said, "Phyllis, in front of every friend you have, I promise to cherish you and love you for all my tomorrows. Will you marry me?" All the forest folk held its breath, waiting for a reply. Normally fearful and fidgety, Mrs. Rabbit boldly threw her arms around his neck and kissed him. She almost knocked him over as she shouted, "Yes!"
Chapter 46, Gossip and Giggles, Discussion and Questions, Gossip and Concern. Question 1. Is gossip a good thing or a bad thing? Let's start with this question, and my answer is, it depends on the motivation. In the forest, the community is truly happy and excited for Phyllis Rabbit. They are all sharing in the thrill of a new member of the community. Gossip takes an evil turn if lies or hurtful accusations are being spread. When the motivation is to be hurtful for someone else's selfish gain, then gossip is wrong. The forest community is motivated by their love for Phyllis Rabbit. They are protective of her and want to be sure this stranger is worthy of her affections. Question 2. Before welcoming someone new into your circle of friends, is it important to evaluate their motivations?
I am the composer and performer for all the music in this video. Both audio recordings and the printed scores are available on mybestfriendsliveinthe.woods.com. I will provide the link below. The painted illustrations are also my creation. Prints are available on mybestfriendsliveinthe.woods.com. This is a novel. The chapters are meant to be heard in the order in which they were written. And while each chapter can stand alone, they do build as new characters are introduced and past events are referred to. Please be sure to like, share, and subscribe. The chapters are numbered, so if you're just joining us, be sure to go back and watch from Chapter 1.
In a dream, in a trance, my spirit flies to the pink horizon of the forest, where fairies say, "Come and play," and the animals say, "There's a better way," an enchanted land of love. My best friend.